Thanks very much, Ian. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. J'espère que vous appréciez.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you appreciate the discussions here this morning. Now we will meet our panelists this morning. Madame Imbleau.
Of the Montreal Port Authority, with 25 years of experience in the public service sector, Martin drives a vision of the port as a strategic asset and an economic engine, an engaged community stakeholder, and a leader in environmental and sustainable development. Please join me in welcoming Martin. Rhona DelFrari is Chief Sustainability Officer and Senior Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement at Cenovus Energy. Rhona works to ensure ESG considerations are embedded in the company's strategy and business plans, and Rhona is also responsible for leading the communications efforts and building strong relationships with stakeholders. This includes working with Indigenous community members, government officials, and community partners. Welcome, Rhona. And Laura Miller is Head of Public Policy and Communications at Uber in Canada. Laura's work centers on two key areas of focus: labor, where she negotiated and now leads the implementation of Uber's historic agreement with the UFCW Canada, and sustainability, where she's working across industry, NGOs, and government to help drivers make a fair and early transition to electric vehicles. Thank you for joining us, Laura. Good morning, everybody. And what a fantastic start to the morning. You need somebody like Mia at 8 a.m. on a Saturday. She did an amazing job. So maybe where I thought we'd start for the panel is if we think about national economies and what it takes to compete and prosper in a net zero economy, industry leadership's needed at all levels. You see that represented in this room, you see it on this stage. Through some of the work that PwC's done with the Net Zero Council and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we've worked with companies who are making not only commitments, but making progress against those commitments. And they're making material investments as they seek to decarbonize. So my question for the panel, and maybe I'll start with Laura. Rhona and I are still potentially adjusting from Western time zones, so bear with us a little bit this morning. As we think about this discussion, Laura, how can Canada continue to demonstrate leadership in moving towards net zero? And how's Uber looking at this and thinking about this?
Great question. Thank you for having me here this morning, bright and early on a Saturday. It's a great question. I think where I want to start is really with the Chamber's report on net zero. And I think the title of it, How We Get There Matters, is really important and it's key because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do in terms of getting to net zero, it's a team sport. It's not government alone, it's not industry alone, it's all of us working collaboratively. And so when I think about what we need here in Canada, just echoing some of the themes from that very well-crafted, thoughtful report, first of all, we need the government to show up with more funding. I think the fact that right now, and they are obviously making announcements and commitments in the billions of dollars, but this is wholesale change, and it actually requires more of a financial commitment from the government. So that's one. I think the second thing is that they do need to work more closely with industry and different stakeholders. I think oftentimes in government, there's this mentality of kind of like wanting to solve on your own. And with something that is this transformational, I think we do need government to be consulting more closely with business, with stakeholders, because we all have the same goal. We all want to get there. I think, the idea, the debate around whether or not we're in a climate emergency is over. And so I think it's really about how we bring people together and how we do it in a transparent way. I think the fact that, we're about to embark on in a world where, our auto manufacturers have to reach certain targets when it comes to manufacturing electric vehicles, that shift for consumers, we're not talking about it enough. And I do think that there is a lot more that we can be doing alongside government to get there. At Uber, we have made a commitment to become a zero emissions platform by 2040, which is an extraordinary commitment when you consider the fact that we don't actually own the vehicles. We are a platform. So the question for us is, how do we actually use that platform to enact change, to encourage drivers to make that transition earlier? And at the end of the day, we know it will have an impact because a high mileage rideshare driver, when they transition to an electric vehicle, it has 3 to 4 times the impact than you or me. So the reality is that there's a lot that we can do. We have to get there together, and we really need government to invest more and to welcome us in that discussion and dialogue about how we achieve that.
I'm watching the wheels turning. Go at it, Rhona.
Well, I'm thinking ditto for everything that you said. I absolutely agree. The scale of the challenge of the energy transition is something that most people can't really comprehend. You know, it's easy to have media clips or, you know, a Twitter blurb that says, we're going to do this. That's great. But I agree with you. We're way beyond the talk about that. Everybody agrees now. Industry knows this is just base business. No matter what sector you're in, it's base business. We need to get to net zero. I mean, so Cenovus has for many years had an aspiration to get to net zero by 2050. And more recently, we updated our GHG emissions reduction commitments to, we're committed to 35% absolute emissions reduction across all of our operations by 2035, which will, of course will be updated on our path to net zero. But that's not something that we do lightly. That takes a lot of very robust analysis to figure out what's possible, and that's a stretch target for us. Because while some technologies exist, the technologies that are going to get us to 2050 net zero, not just Cenovus or the oil and gas sector, but all sectors, are just in their infancy now. We talk a lot about hydrogen. That's in its infancy still. It's great, it's got great potential, but it's very early days. It's not something that is here now at mass scale. We talk about things like direct air capture, which I do believe will need to be a part of the mix for 2050, but these projects are just tiny pilot projects now around the world. And so it is great, you know, it makes good headlines to say, we're going to invest in these great shiny objects, but when the reality hits the road, these things cost a lot of money, and most of them are a cost to business. So carbon capture and storage on its own for an oil and gas company, which is a significant part of how we will achieve in the oil and gas sector our emissions reductions, it's a proven technology. We've done it for many years when it's linked to enhanced oil recovery. When you link it to that, that has economic benefits, so because you're making more money out of the oil production. But when you just do at the scale that we need to do carbon capture and storage globally, it is not a moneymaker, it's a cost. That's fine, we need to do it, but we need to figure out a way to have these partnerships with government so that countries that are being more aggressive with their with their decarbonization goals like Canada, that the industries in those countries don't become uncompetitive with other jurisdictions in the world that they're competing with. We really want to, in this country, our oil and gas sector is committed to getting to net zero. We've made that pledge as oil sands players. We cannot do it alone, and we can't do it at the cost of chasing our investors to other jurisdictions where the returns are better. Because investors want us to get to net zero, but they also want us to make money. And so that's the big challenge right now that we're at. We're at the how. How do we do this? We're beyond the what should we do or why should we do it. We're at the how.
I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss carbon leakage and cash leakage in that panel. Thanks for having me this morning. Vous savez, l'industrie maritime, c'est
No, the maritime industries is 3% of the gas and petrol, and it's very important.
quite fortunate because we're geographically well located. We can electrify most of our operation. We will be transforming our locomotive to hydrogen very soon. Most of our cranes are electric, so Scope 1 GHG, we're doing great. The ones of our operators, not so bad also because they can electrify most of their business. The challenge is the shipping itself. 75% of the GHG emitted in the food chain is emitted by the ships themselves. And there's no cookie cutter approach. Of course, electrification will be one solution, but when a wire and a battery cannot do the trick, we need an indirect electrification. We need green liquids. And today, the industry is way too much isolated. We're all having our own pilot project. We're spending a lot of money. We're testing things. And where the leadership we think is required by the country, by Canada, by the government, is to kind of federate and put together people so we can really focus on the right technologies, make bad decisions in some cases, but don't repeat the bad cases and bad decisions. So I see really a foursome of players in that leadership. It's private sector, us, the port, consumers, representative, but we need the government to overcome what I call the dilemma infrastructure. If we build it, they will come. We cannot do it alone. We need those four players to beat that infrastructure dilemma.
Maybe if we tug on that thread a little bit, because all three of you raised this in a different way. So if we think back to June 2021, we enshrined the Emissions Accountability Act. We've got targets for 2050, we've got targets for 2030, we've seen the emissions reduction plan. As you think about that concept of competitiveness, it's a team sport. In your view, how does our emissions reduction plan present challenges or opportunities for businesses that want to go and set the kinds of aspirations that each of you have set? And then maybe even further than that, which I think would be of interest to our audience, is what changes would you want to see to this plan to get at some of the things that you've each talked about? You're all grown up, so I'm happy to let you go.
I can start with this one, sure. So there's never a challenge without an opportunity, especially when it comes to the energy transition. I'll state that right off the beginning. And I think that, you mentioned it, we all have this shared outcome. Government, the Canadian public, industry, we all have the shared outcome that we're trying to get to net zero. We're trying to reduce or decarbonize, or whatever term you want to use, as much as we possibly can. It makes good business sense. From the business perspective. But I think that it's all about what's realistic and what can be done. So we are past the stage where people are fighting or being dragged along on this journey. You're hearing all of us, all of our sectors are there. We want this to happen, and we see the benefits of this happening, not just for our companies and our sectors and the entire Canadian economy. So if we're past that hurdle of convincing industry that it has to happen, and we are past that, then how do we make it happen? And it absolutely, the government and industry, as you were saying, needs to collaborate. And so I think where it starts, and some of you heard me talk about the Pathways Alliance as an example last night. So the Pathways Alliance is Canada's 6 largest oil companies working together through this alliance to get to net zero emissions. And when I say working together, we threw our competitive instincts aside and we said, look, we're not going to do this by working alone. And so, for example, we're sharing all of our feasibility studies that we've done on carbon capture and storage. We have, I think, 9 or 12 of them done now. Open it up, get rid of all the NDAs and share all of that. So I really, we also see ourselves as a model for other sectors. We haven't found any other model globally that's doing this at the scale, that this type of collaboration that we're doing right now. We meet our CEOs along with the steering committee, which I'm on, meet every Friday morning at 7 a.m. for 2 years now. The CEOs of the 6 largest oil companies, that's how serious we are about this. We meet 7 a.m. every Friday morning, and then multiple other meetings, and 200 plus of our staff working on this. And so when you get your minds to it as an industry and work together, you can do this. And it's been so much easier for us to work with the federal and provincial governments because we've come to them as a group and they have acknowledged that. They've said, wow, it's so, this is a wonderful, you have a plan, you're presenting us a plan, and we can work with that. And now we see government at the federal level being a bit more innovative than you would typically see government doing. And they're like, okay, we need this to happen. We see you are a large chunk of our emissions in Canada. You have come to us with a plan on how to get there. The missing part of your plan is you can't 100% fund this on your own, plus you need some regulatory changes or you need policy to support that. So now let's work together. And so we're sitting down around tables with the government. But I think as business leaders, take that initiative. Don't wait for government to take that lead. Take that lead. Get together with your other companies. Forget about being competitors. There's certain things where as Canada, our industries need to work together so that we can have a Canadian win. We're at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce here. We can do this as Canada. If all of our sectors work together, start it. You just start with some conversations. So that sounded more than a rant than an answer to that question, I think. But I am very, on the optimistic side and the opportunity, I think that all of us as business leaders can make it happen, and government will jump on that, because it is hard for government to take the first move. They're setting these very ambitious goals and targets, but in the end, it's all of us as business that have to actually deliver on them.
So I absolutely agree with everything that you say, and I'm actually, I feel quite optimistic to know that you've come together as an industry, that government has kind of welcomed what you've had to say. Because I think ultimately for us, and I'm sure that we see this every day, regardless of the level of government that we work in, but from our perspective, it's great when government is bold, but that needs to be backed up by two things. One, funding, appropriate funding, which again, I think is lacking in this instance. And the second thing for us is really around getting out of the way to a certain extent, right? So if they say we have this target and industry comes together with like-minded stakeholders and says, okay, we're in agreement on the target, we'll come up with a plan and come back to you on how we can implement it. If government is receptive to that, I think that is fantastic. And not to delve into labor because we're talking about sustainability, but when Uber got to the table with UFCW Canada, which again, it's a novel agreement, first of its kind in the world, it really came down to what are the common themes, what is our objective, and can we get together and come up with a plan that we can take to government, right? And I think that if government is willing and wants to see innovation, they should enable it when it comes forward and not stand in its way. So it's really encouraging to hear that they're doing that, particularly for this sector. And then I think as we go forward, I think we need to start thinking about our goals, and are they bold enough? Are they ambitious enough? I know compared to the European Union, a number of countries there, we're actually a little bit behind. We saw the US, do something remarkable in the Inflation Reduction Act. And now it's a question of, okay, so we are no longer necessarily leading. We might be in a situation where, we've made it more challenging for our private sector. So I think a lot of it is also just not resting on our laurels and what we've announced in the past, but also just kind of seeing what's happening around us and optimizing and advancing the things that are going to make us even more competitive in this space, because we're no longer the leader on the continent.
Can I clarify something before you jump in? I don't want to leave the impression that I 100% agree with what the government has currently proposed with the Industrial Emissions Reduction Act. So but when I say we're working together, what's been proposed for the oil and gas sector is a 42% emissions reduction from 2019 to 2030. That's not possible. It's just not technically possible. Even if 100% of those projects were funded right now, you can't move those projects forward enough. And so those are the types of discussions we're having right now with government is, let's be realistic. Again, shared goal. What you've proposed is not realistic in any way, shape, or form. Here's what is realistic. And what they're saying to us is, okay, show us what's realistic. So I'm hopeful that those conversations with them will continue.
So, no, absolutely. And I was just optimistic about the process, not
Absolutely,
necessarily
I agree,
anything
yeah.
else.
I agree.
Well, I would start with, or piggybacking what you said, is that a vision without a great execution plan remains an hallucination. And there's so many good things in this that you don't know exactly where to start. And I'm concerned about being we're not laser focused. And one thing that should be an obsession for us all is ensuring a level playing field on carbon taxing. There's too many disparity on land, on sea, in different jurisdictions that we don't know where to start. It's tough to have international tradings. There's so much carbon leakage that leads to cash leakage in other jurisdictions. And if there's a place where Canada and us all should have a common view, is establishing a level playing field on carbon tax. We won't achieve any of the goal if we have one concept in Canada, one in Quebec, one in the US, one in Europe. Europe has just decided over last summer to include the shipping industry in the carbon taxing. Of course, there's a lot of complaint, but it's getting closer to that level playing field. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, and a ship representative said, you know what? Impose the same tax, even if it's significant, everywhere in the world, then we will shift to other alternative fuel. I'm not promoting that type of taxes, but we need a concerted effort, and I think one of the breaks that we have today is too many jurisdictions have different carbon tax concepts.
Maybe we'll tie two of those threads together, and I can't wait to see where the three of you go with this, is if we think about Canada as not existing as a self-contained economy, and we operate in a global context, capital is not constrained to Canada. It's not a sovereign right. How do we start to, and Martin, you had a really interesting point in terms of leveling the playing field. How do we level the playing field further beyond carbon tax? And how should we be thinking about this as business leaders in terms of an inclusive and orderly transition? I think a lot about how do we not leave communities behind within Canada as well as globally, right? How do you not create energy poverty? What are the things that we need to be tackling as a business community or bringing to government in terms of seeing that transition, not only get to those goals, but getting to them in a way that goes beyond just sort of the energy side of it, to Laura's point around fair labor, inclusive communities, people participating, not causing energy shocks and poverty. What are your thoughts?
That's an interesting one and philosophical one. You know what? I'm a human rights by training lawyer, and it's funny to see that energy has become a discriminatory factor in the country, in different communities. And it's really a shame because there's not too many countries in the world that can have the advantage that we have on the energy side. I've spent 25 years in the oil and gas sector. It's fun because now I've switched to the other side, which I think is the dark side. Now I'm the consuming side. And I realize that economically speaking, the regions are treated differently, and there are people who are left behind. But we're so fortunate in the country. I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and it's going to be a tough winter. It's going to be a tough winter, and I'm not too concerned about Canada, but what I'm concerned about is isolated communities. In Quebec, notably, because I'm more familiar with that, but I'm concerned about the energy, the lack of energy options in the northern portion of the country, notably in the Inuit territory and some indigenous communities that are suffering from that. So I think we should do much better as representative of the industry and with government representative to help those communities.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying, and I do think that sometimes we get so focused when we're talking about energy transition on addressing climate change. Absolutely, we need to focus on that, but we forget about the point about affordable, reliable, clean energy. Affordable, reliable, clean energy, because for most people, the affordable and reliable, if you don't have that, the clean gets thrown away. And so we do see those situations in Europe right now where I would say that, and it is cause for us in Canada to go back to the cry that we've heard for many decades, those of us that have worked in the sector, about the need for a Canadian energy plan. And now it's a Canadian energy and environment plan, or energy and climate. You can't do one without the other. But if we don't do this in a thoughtful way, in the near term, I agree, Canada, we're very well situated with our energy supply. We are blessed in this country. We are the envy of the world when it comes to our electricity grid, such a clean grid, such a reliable grid, when it comes to our oil and gas, natural gas resource in this country, when it comes to our other minerals that we need for a lot of the others. We are so lucky, and we take that for granted as Canadians. We just assume that that's always going to be the case. But if we don't have a thoughtful plan, and even when you look at the US, I mean, I was in Washington earlier this year at the same time that Biden was begging Saudi Arabia to send them more oil. I was in the UK the exact same day. I was talking to insurers that were pulling out of the oil sands, insurance companies, because we were too dirty. At the same time that the British Prime Minister was actually on a flight over to Saudi Arabia, again, begging the Saudis to send the UK more oil, whereas I'm sitting right there as a Canadian oil producer saying, okay, hello, who would you rather have your oil from? And, you know, there was a lot of interesting conversations, I would say. But we need more. I mean, look at the grids. The world needs way more energy going forward because there are many countries that want to live the lifestyle we did and deserve to live the lifestyle that we live here. And yes, we need more renewables. Of course we do. Nobody is going to say that. We do. But, in times of very high heat or very, very low temperatures, wind and solar are not ideal. Those are the times that they do not actually produce. So you do need to have a backup plan. You do need some natural gas in there or nuclear or something else. And so it is not, it is an all of the above, and it has to be thoughtful, and we can't be enough with the extremes in these discussions, enough with it. We need to do what's practical. If we need to reduce emissions, let's get the money going to the place where you can reduce the most emissions the fastest. And enough with, we can't do this because of this, or we can't do this. No, let's put our money where it's going to have the greatest impact now and be thoughtful in our energy plans.
So maybe we spent a lot of time talking about the macro, and given our platform, we provide flexible earning opportunities for drivers. Maybe I'll talk more on the individual neighbor level, because we talked about obviously the country, we talk about provinces, regions, we talk about communities, but I think at the end of the day, for us, and we spend a lot of time thinking about individuals, whether they be the drivers on the platform or consumers, and in trying to incentivize them to take a greener option on our platform, whether it's Uber Green, which is a hybrid or EV ride. The fact that in some cities you can actually see that the public transit solution, because sometimes that's a faster, more efficient way for you to move around a city, first mile and last mile. But I do think that what it comes down to for me is I think about the kind of the fair and inclusive transition. And I think about, the policies that our government's put in place, whether it's around, EV incentives or charging infrastructure. And right now, currently, those incentives and that infrastructure is located in areas where there are people who are kind of in the upper socioeconomic class. And when we think about, drivers who who oftentimes, I think 62% of drivers on our platform say that their vehicle is secondhand. We know there isn't a developed secondhand EV market. We know there are no incentives for the secondhand market, except for I think BC just recently made a change, which is encouraging. We know right now that, there's a lot of charging infrastructure being installed in kind of, richer communities, neighborhoods around the highways. And then when we start thinking about like denser locations where perhaps where homeownership is not an option, or in downtown cores, it's non-existent. So right now, if you're a driver in Toronto and you're considering an EV, you might actually think to yourself, I can't get that EV because there's nowhere for me to charge in the middle of the day, which obviously would be a concern for any Canadian. But for a Canadian who is actually trying to earn their living or earn additional money through driving and not knowing where they can charge their vehicle and what the downtime is going to be for them, that's pretty extraordinary. So I do think that, when it comes to these types of changes or these types of incentive programs, it's really important that, government maybe, move outside of industry a little bit and actually talk directly to the individuals who are struggling on a day-to-day basis and trying to figure out what their next vehicle looks like, how they might charge, the decisions that they're taking in terms of their home and the energy use. Because I think sometimes there's too much of a disconnect. And we, as someone who used to work in government, someone who, obviously right now works with government, oftentimes we see our own circumstances and we think we can design programs that can help solve it for us individually. But I do worry that we are leaving a significant number of Canadians behind in this transition.
So maybe a little bit of a speed round on this next question. So I'll give you a long lead in to think about your top three. You've each alluded to sort of the need for funding. And if I think about how do we finance this transition, that's not all government, but what is missing in terms of unlocking some of the private sector willingness to invest when we look at this? You're each leaders on the stage between the pathways, Uber's historic agreement with the union, I'll call them aggressive, ambitious aspirations that the port has set, Martin. If you had a magic wand, like top three things you would want to see government do to unlock some of that funding, either themselves or for us, from a policy perspective.
I'll jump in. Private money always find a way. That's the beauty of capitalism. I think what we need is, coming back to your word before, is avoiding the buzzword, the new concept, the new thing, having a long-term pathways and avoiding shocks. When we decided to go in Quebec into the wind business, we went all in on the wind. And then maybe it's going to be solar. Then we're back at hydro. And then we'll be back, we'll jump into the hydrogen bandwagon. It all makes sense, but it creates shocks. It creates cost shock. We don't develop the expertise, and we buy all the energy from one sources at one point in time, which is the worst thing to do. So having a pathways and a common development long-term path would be required. Avoid changing the philosophy and the concept every 4 or 5 years, and really think about establishing the infrastructures and the option on a very, very long term. And I think the current challenge is doing that on the green liquids and hydrogen. Let's establish something for 10, 20, 30 years and not just isolated. And the money will come. At that point in time, the money will follow if we do see that long-term path.
Policy certainty, is that what you're talking about? I always think that's an oxymoron, but yeah, we all ask for it, don't we? I agree with you. We need that. I think some of the challenge for funding is, as well as we do the energy transition, is that a lot of the, you hear, it depends which report you read, there's 7 trillion, there's 30 trillion, there's whatever trillion, there's trillions out there for green funding and green financing. But the challenge is that all of those people that are backing those funds, they actually want returns, shockingly. They want to make money off of the money that they're investing. And a lot of these opportunities to really hit the big decarbonization, not just the little tiny bits here and there, but the big decarbonization right now, they're very high risk investments. Not all of them. There are some that are proven, but a lot of them that are really going to get us going fast on this pathway that we've set in Canada, high risk and don't have returns initially. I mean, for us, the carbon capture and storage network that we're talking about through the oil sands, that's a pure cost to our companies. We're not making money off of that, and that's fine, and we understand why we need to do it and all of that. But it is hard, when we're looking at others that want to come in and invest in it, we're like, okay, well, that's great. We would love to have you as partners, but there's no money to be made off of this. This is a cost. And so that's where we need the governments to partner with industry, and eventually, I mean, there is money to be made off of all of this. So the technology developers, we're all going to be buying technology. This is going to be, in Alberta in particular, the next big boom. It's going to be carbon capture and other decarbonization projects. There's going to be billions spent on it. So there's money that will flow. It's just that how do you make sure where it's that initial person, that initial company that's doing that investment, those are costs. And so how do we overcome that? And that's where we work with government, I think.
So, top of my wish list, which might be absolutely impossible, but I would love to see government depoliticize this issue. Like, I think a lot of the times, they're making big investments, but I think it's very much seen as a policy file that's going to be important to the next election. Obviously, it's important for the next election, but I would love to kind of get out of that mode, and I would love to see government work more closely with industry, with interested stakeholders, and not have the war of words that we see sometimes with different industries and different sectors, because it's not helpful. It's not helpful when we've all agreed we need to get there, we have to work together to get there, to then have, whether it's the anonymous source or someone on the record say something that attacks, a part of an important part of the Canadian economy, with a group of stakeholders who are trying to get there. So I think that the number one thing government could do is depoliticize this issue, or try to depoliticize this issue. I think, again, from a funding perspective, they need to really, get the checkbook back out. And then the other thing, as I've talked about before, is they really just need to bring people together. I, again, don't want to harken back to like hope and hard work, but I really wish that there was a desire and that kind of tone and tenure to this conversation as we go forward, because again, this is unbelievable change at a scale that we haven't seen in such a long time, and we're not going to get there if we treat it as business as usual.
And I think, too, people need to be aware of the trade-offs for all of our sectors. I think that's what's been missing, too, is that people are like, yeah, let's do this. Somebody needs to do this. But it is going to have an impact on everybody in Canada as we pursue this energy transition and get to our goals. And the trade-offs are often not talked about. What does it mean? We can do that. We can decarbonize, but what does that mean?
So I have one more question for the panel. For the audience, if you want to take advantage of Slido, you get the opportunity to ask some questions of the panel as well. But my final question that I have for all of you is, I love the candor. I also love hearing some of the very positive things of how Canada's positioned. We have a great diversity in terms of energy sources. We have a great diversity across the country. We have access to critical minerals. There's lots of good things there. There's something that I won't say is uniquely Canadian, but I think it's important in a Canadian context, which is Indigenous communities and the role that they play, should play, how business should interact with them. And when I think about something in the neighborhood of 200 projects ranging everything from benefits agreements to actual joint or direct ownership of some of these, how can we as business leaders, how can Canada more generally really support this net zero transition in terms of elevating that Indigenous leadership, and I'm using participation not as a colloquialism, but as a genuine term. And Martin, how about you?
That's a very important topic, issue, and actions that we're dedicating time on. We need to stop the consultation mode. We've all done projects where we were in consultation with communities, with Indigenous communities. That is simply not the right way to do, because we're really in it for a transaction purpose. Like any community, we need to engage into a long-term discussion, partnership, and engage them, even potentially as partner in projects. But the time has passed where you sit down and you say, I've consulted, and then you move on. I personally don't believe in that mode at all anymore, and we should have much more meaningful discussion and engagement with the communities.
You couldn't see Rhona's face, but I could.
We could do a whole panel on this topic alone. So the oil and gas sector, along with the mining sector, is by far the largest employer of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we've looked, Cenovus alone has done $3 billion over the last decade with Indigenous businesses. And one of our commitments as part of our ESG targets is to do another $1.2 billion by 2025 with Indigenous-owned businesses. And so this is something that's near and dear to my heart. It also is part of my portfolio. But I think I am so proud of the Indigenous communities in Canada for standing up and saying enough. They're saying enough is enough. We do not want to just consult. We don't want just you to come in and give us a donation for our community center. We want to be at the table from the beginning, and absolutely they should. For the oil sand, Cenovus is broader than just oil sands, but for the oil sands sector alone, we run through, Indigenous communities are our neighbors. That is who lives in the communities where the oil sands projects are developed. And for this particular, for the foundational project of this Pathways Alliance, it's a CCS project that has, runs through the heart of the oil sands. We don't have any commitments. We don't have an agreement on this project. We haven't even started putting pen to paper on the agreement. We're moving forward with feasibility studies. One of the first things we did was get together all of the chiefs and council of every one of those communities to say, what would your participation in this project look like? And so I agree, this has to be about partnership with Indigenous communities. And there's so much knowledge in those communities when we talk about the environment and the energy transition, that they are a valued partner.
I think, on this end, to echo what's been said already, I think moving from a transactional experience to one where we're building relationships and partnerships are so important. I think in terms of ensuring that, Indigenous people have the ability and the opportunity to benefit directly from, on an ongoing basis, from these types of investments in projects. But I think as well, again, when we talk about the fair and just transition, I do think about, Indigenous people, their communities, some of the reserves, where I think it will continue to be a struggle, and so hope that the government continues to invest, and in that, we continue to shine a spotlight on these issues, because they've gone on for far too long. And I think until, we have resolved these pieces, I do think that one of the most important things for all of us is to be aware of, the conditions and, how things are changing. But the reality is there's still a very, very long way to go.
Maybe a follow-up for Rhona in particular on this is, as I listen to each of you, do you think we make better decisions when we're more inclusive? Like, what's Cenovus's experience been in terms of investing that effort? I hear a lot from external investors about it being Indigenous communities sometimes a risk to looking at Canadian investments, and that doesn't sound like it's been your experience.
No, it's not at all how I think Cenovus or I approach that personally. We've had really great relationships, and it's so interesting when I go, so I visit a lot of the Indigenous communities and meet with the leadership, and when I go into these communities, and I've been with Cenovus, or I've been doing this job for 15 years now, so I've had quite a few experiences with it. And when I go into those communities, we sit down at the table, and the first thing that is said, it doesn't matter where the community is, first thing that is said consistently is, how can we do business with you? How can we partner with you? And I love that. I mean, that is a perfect way of thinking. And that is against the stereotypes that are out there. Because these communities, there's limited, in some of the remote regions in particular, there's very limited economic opportunity for these communities. Doing business with us is the economic opportunity, and they want to deal with the addictions. There's a lot of challenges with addictions in many of the communities. They want to deal with the low unemployment. They want to deal with the housing challenges. And the way to do that, they see it very clearly, is, okay, let's be part of any kind of economic activity that's happening. And our feeling has always been, if we want the communities near us to share in our success. So most of our projects are very multi-decade projects. So we're going to be in those communities or near those communities for multiple decades. And those are not just neighbors, those are not just stakeholders, those are partners.
And there's a shortage of talent everywhere. There are neighbors, so let's help each other. So let's pick all the brains that we can to help our respective economies.
I've got a few questions that have come in from the audience. So maybe I'll start with this one, which is, I think, some kudos, Rhona, for you and the Pathways Alliance around the important work you're doing in terms of net zero. What advice do you have for some of the smaller oil and gas producers about how to join into that journey?
Yeah, and it is a challenge, and it's even, when you talk about environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, even disclosure, we're a large company, and it's still a very challenging and daunting task to keep up with all of the expectations of ESG. And I always say, we're asked a lot from securities commissions and others that are doing for all of this, for energy transition and for disclosure and all of it. We're asked for our opinions, and I always say, make sure that you don't put in any type of regulation or set any standards that are going to be too challenging for smaller companies. And that's important. It's really important, because for small businesses, you're already swamped. I mean, my parents were small business owners. You're focused on running your companies, and then you do not have the time. I can hardly keep up with everything that is changing and happening when it comes to climate and ESG. This world is so fast moving. And so there have to be extra supports or extra considerations when it comes to some of the smaller companies, but there are things that you can do, and I think the larger companies like ours have a responsibility to share some of our knowledge, and we're happy to do that with the smaller companies and to give advice. I mean, we're not going to win as a sector in Canada by one company competing with another when it comes to environment, social, and governance. We need to win as Canada, as a Canadian sector. And I would say not just for oil and gas. I think that's the attitude that all of our sectors in Canada have to have. We have to think Team Canada first. And so I think that for the smaller players, you're not going to be able to do the same as the larger players, but you can do something. And the bigger players have a responsibility to share their knowledge with the smaller players about how we're moving forward on the ESG ambitions and how we're moving forward with the energy transition.
Maybe a question for each of you, which is, when you think about climate risk, whether that's sort of physical or transition and policy risk, how are your organizations measuring and managing that? And what is that doing in terms of your own internal sort of investment strategies around net zero?
The climate resiliency is top of mind. Two things I would say. We are already preparing our infrastructures for different type of severe weather. Things will be different. We need to adapt our infrastructure. And we do believe that the most resilient, the most climate resilient food chain will be the one will be positioned adequately in the future. So physically speaking, we need to adapt our infrastructure. Second, the food chain and the supply chain that emit the less carbon will also be the one to position itself more strategically in the future. So if you can go out there and say, you know what, I'll be resilient climately, and the supply chain that goes through my port, my community emits less GHG than anyone else, well, people in industry will use your facilities before going elsewhere. So there's a commercial opportunity, but we also need to adapt our facilities.
I love the resilience comment.
I mean, I love what you just said, because I see that as the Canadian advantage and the Canadian opportunity. We're a small enough company that we can actually work together on this. And, you know, for all of our products, why can't we be seen? Canada has still a good reputation globally. You know, there's been surveys out there for oil and gas in particular. Where do you want to get your oil and gas globally? And they'll say, Canada. We'd like to get our oil and gas from Canada. And it's the same for multiple other sectors. And that's the opportunity.
I was going to say everywhere but Quebec, but I'm
Well,
joking.
you know,
I'm joking.
we can work on that separately. But there is an opportunity here to have a Canadian brand when it comes to climate. So yes, prepare ourselves as this country to be able to deal with any physical changes from climate. But then we already have the world's, lowest carbon natural gas production. Okay, well, let's get that exported. We got some challenges there with exporting our natural gas, but we've got, there's been, BC has done a lot of studies to show that it's the world's lowest carbon. And the same with steel, the same with a whole bunch of our sectors, a whole bunch that you work in. Why can't that be brand Canada? That, buy from Canada if the world truly cares about ESG. And they put their money where their mouths are about, insisting that companies care about ESG, not just climate, not just GHG, but the broad ESG. Then we are so well positioned as Canada, from human rights, from our strong regulation, from our transparency. This is Canada's chance, and we need to start. And it's not just about marketing it that way. We have to market it that way, but we actually have to do it and prove it and have the data behind us, and then tell the world, come to Canada for all of our goods and services, because we're doing it the right way.
So I think for, Uber, again, being a platform which is a little bit different than my co-panelists on the stage, the way that we think about this is really around, setting our objective, and then being able to share, as a global company, share with local governments the best path forward to get to the end objective. The reality is, as we talked about earlier, there are a number of jurisdictions where they are way farther ahead of us. I think in particular around Paris and London. And I think for us to be able to take those examples and be able to demonstrate to government, how it is. There was this great piece in Bloomberg the other day just about how they've turned around the EVs in London, and we've gone from, in 2019 there were 100 EVs on the Uber platform, to today, 4 years later, there's now 7,000. And so what are those kind of those regulatory issues, those policy opportunities to help affect change and to make that real? The other thing that we are doing for Uber is we are releasing on a regular basis a transparency report around our emissions, which was somewhat controversial in the company, as you might imagine. But the reality is that if we can't measure it, if we're not sharing that, how are we holding ourselves accountable? And so that's another way that we think about this, because the reality is today in the US and Canada, based on the current policy framework in place, we are not going to get to target. So our hope is, over time, with policy change, we can demonstrate through these reports, the actual impact that government change is having in helping reduce emissions across North America.
That takes us to an interesting question from the audience, which is, I think, Rhona, you said it quite directly earlier, that, for the oil sands, 2030 is not possible in terms of what's been set by others as the target. And the question that was asked is, do we think Canada's positioned to hit its 2050 goal, given absence of technologies at scale, all of the things that we've talked about? What are your thoughts?
Can I throw a rock in the pond?
For sure.
I'm from Quebec, and Quebec thinks that they're doing great. Here's the stats. 37% by 2030. We've reduced our GHG by 9 or 10% over the last 20 years. We are making no gain year after year. So how to reach 37.5 in 2030? There's only one way to do it. Because 40% of the economy relies on electricity, but close to 60% on oil and gas. And on the production side, it's government concern. On the consuming side, it's consumers' concern. But the middle point, the transportation sector, the heavy transportation sector, well, every time we reduce GHG by 1 ton in Quebec, the transportation sector hits it with 2. So not only we're not making progress because of the heavy transportation sector, but we're going backward. And it is no one's concern. It's no one's agenda. I'm frustrated that whatever I think about, we hear officials or initiatives, it's always about production and ultimate consumers. Makes a lot of sense. But the missing link is the transportation sector that emits 40% of the transportation sector, and we're going backward. So am I confident to reach the goal? We need technologies for the transportation sector yesterday.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say that I don't want to make a prediction on 2050, but what I'm looking forward to in 2030 is the reckoning, right? Because that is the next milestone, which is by 2030, we have these ambitious goals, these things are going to happen, and the reality is that, based on what you experience in Quebec, things that we see in other jurisdictions, the path we're on today, I think we're going to have a reckoning in 2030 as to why we did not achieve that. I'm an optimist by nature, so I hope that, we're just slightly short of the goal, but I think we're going to fall well short of the goal. And I'm hopeful that perhaps that will change the way we think about this, the way that we talk about it, the way that we consult and work together, and the funding associated to it. But I do think that I wonder a lot about 2030, because I think sometimes, we make these bold commitments, or like we have to put this goal out there because we have to stretch to reach it. But I am a little bit concerned that we're not going to get there in 2030. But I am super optimistic that will come with that a bit of a reckoning, a reorganization around the things that we need to do, the things that we need to invest in to get there. But again, unless there is like fundamental change in the next year or two, I will be shocked if we get there.
Yeah, we're almost in 2023. And most of these massive decarbonization projects take years for consultation. So the reality is they're not going to happen by 2030, and that's the problem. We started too late. And just for a reality check about what this will take, during the peak of the global pandemic, when the world was shut down, at the peak, emissions were reduced globally by 15%. And this was a global shutdown, 15%. And now they're already back up to where we were before. And so, that is how hard this is. And nobody ever wants to point at consumers. Politically, that's death, to say that the consumers have to change their habits. And when you do surveys, consumers generally, Canada, US, doesn't matter where you ask, they don't want to spend more than $100 per year per family to address, towards decarbonization efforts. And so this is where we land. It's 100, and I've seen multiple surveys. People are not willing to spend more than $100 per family per year to contribute to greater emissions reductions. And so it all falls to industry, and that's fine, but there's multiple challenges with that.
It also ignores the fact that we have to incur some additional emissions to actually build out the rest of the infrastructure to get to where we need to go, I think. But I refuse to end on that note because it's so depressing. So I think we're going to take one more quick trip through the panel. last question is, I know at least Martin and Rhona are attending COP27. What makes you most hopeful about Canada and net zero?
I'm not sure if I will be attending, but I think we just have the brain. We have the resources, we have the brain, the recipe is there. I see the cake, we all see the cake, and we think we know the recipe. Let's just do it.
Yeah, we have the will, now let's find the way.
I don't know how I top that. I don't think I can.
It's what you've been saying too.
Cosign.
I'm going to go with Brand Canada. That was one of the great takeaways from today. So please join me in thanking the panelists. That was an excellent discussion.